1. The cold that killed before the enemy did. For the first 15 seconds, give me your full attention, because the settlers of the Wild West did not fear the revolver, the outlaw, or even starvation as much as they feared something far older and far more patient. It crept into their bones without warning, stole the strength from their hands, and claimed entire families before they could cry for help. That enemy was winter itself. Long before bullets ever cracked through the frontier air, cold was already killing. History reminds us again and again that winter has always been a silent executioner. On the Eastern Front during World War II, more than 90,000 soldiers fell not to enemy fire, but to the merciless freeze of 1941. In the Ardennes at the Battle of the Bulge, thousands of American troops were rendered useless by frostbite before they ever saw the enemy. Cold, in every age, has been a strategic force multiplier, an adversary that does not negotiate, does not sleep, and does not miss. And yet, out on the American frontier, settlers confronted another brutal reality. The plains and prairies of the West offered no forests to hide in, no thick timber to warm their homes, and no natural barriers to block the screaming winter wind. Those who arrived unprepared quickly discovered the same truth soldiers had learned in Europe, that this was not uncomfortable cold. This was killing cold. Which leads to the question that shaped one of the most ingenious survival innovations in frontier history. Why did people abandon thick walls, heavy blankets, and bulky coats, and instead burrow beneath the earth like animals? Why did settlers trust a thin layer of soil more than the thickest structure they could build? And why did this ancient logic save countless lives while thicker, stronger, heavier shelters failed? Stay with me, because the answer rewrites everything we think we know about warmth and survival. Second, the false belief that thickness means safety. For most of human history, people believed that the thicker something was, the safer it must be. This assumption shaped armies, architecture, clothing, and even the early cabins of settlers crossing into the frontier. If a coat was heavy, it was declared warm. If a wall was thick, it was called strong. Bulk became comfort, and comfort slowly transformed into faith. But faith doesn't stop the wind. History is studded with the consequences of this mistake. In 1812, Napoleon's Grand Army marched into Russia wearing thick wool coats, confident in their weight and density. Yet tens of thousands froze to death long before seeing Moscow. A century later, during the Winter War, Russian troops marched in layers of bulky clothing, but still succumbed to the cold, while the lightly dressed Finnish soldiers, using refined layering systems rather than thickness moved faster, stayed drier and outlasted them. These were not accidents. These were demonstrations of a scientific truth settlers would eventually rediscover. Thickness does not equal insulation if moisture enters the system. Wool becomes a sponge. Heavy coats trap sweat. Thick walls crack and leak heat the moment humidity creeps in. And on the frontier, moisture was everywhere, rising from the soil, drifting through the air, freezing on every surface it touched. Settlers who trusted bulk learned too late that it was an illusion of safety. Those who survived understood something deeper, that warmth is not won by adding more material, but by controlling what happens inside the layers you already have. And that realization would push them underground, into one of the most misunderstood survival strategies in American history. Third, how humans actually lose heat, the science section. To understand why the dugout was superior to thick-walled cabins, we must understand how the human body loses heat. And fortunately, the science is simple because our ancestors understood it long before we gave it names. Heat loss begins with conduction. When your clothing becomes wet, whether from snow, groundwater, or your own sweat, it clings to your skin and steals warmth directly from your core. Wet fabric does not insulate, it drains life. Early settlers learned this brutally as wool coats soaked through during storms and froze into rigid plates of ice. Then comes convection. When wind pushes through gaps in heavy walls or through thick but damp clothing, it siphons heat away like a silent thief. The Great Plains wind was relentless, and settlers found that no matter how thick their cabins were, the cold simply slipped through the fibers and cracks, pulling heat out with every gust. And finally, evaporation, the most deceptive killer of all. Sweat, even in tiny amounts, cools the body dramatically. Many settlers worked hard through the day, building, hauling, digging, only to collapse in the evening when the sweat trapped in their thick clothing began to freeze. Evaporation punished those who tried to outrun the cold. But here is the key. Dry air has a natural insulating value. It is not fabric that keeps you alive, it is the stable pocket of air that fabric protects. When air stays dry and still, heat remains. When air becomes wet or displaced, warmth disappears. It is dry air, not thick material, that saves lives. This revelation is what ultimately inspired settlers to carve homes into the earth. Underground, the air was stable, the temperature was predictable, moisture could be controlled, and most importantly, the walls did not rely on bulk, they relied on the physics of stillness. And so the greatest survival structure of the frontier was born not from strength or thickness, but from understanding. Fourth, the ancient precedent, cultures that mastered air pocket insulation. Long before modern armies marched into frozen battlefields, humanity had already solved the problem of staying warm. Not with bulk, not with thickness, and certainly not with the heavy fabrics we romanticize today, but with something far more elegant. Air. Across the ancient world, cultures who lived in the harshest climates intuitively understood that survival depended on trapping still pockets of dry air close to the body. They did not wait for science to explain it. They learned it through generations of brutal winters that punished every mistake. The Inuit of the far Arctic mastered this principle to perfection. Their parkas, made of caribou fur, contained countless microscopic air pockets between each hollow hair. These pockets did not merely block the cold, they created an internal climate, a buffer of stillness that preserved warmth even when temperatures plunged far below what any military coat could handle. The Sami of northern Scandinavia took a similar path. Their reindeer hide garments were layered deliberately, not for decoration, but to create strategic chambers of air that let moisture escape while keeping heat sealed in place. The wisdom of layering was not fashion. It was a battle plan against winter. Across the Pacific, the Ainu people crafted clothing from softened tree bark fibers, a material that seems fragile on the surface but was engineered with astonishing effectiveness. The fibers interlocked loosely enough to hold air, yet tightly enough to repel wind, creating insulation rivaling that of modern synthetics. And on the plains of North America, native tribes lined winter garments with dried grasses, weaving nature's simplest insulator into a powerful survival material. Grass, like fur, is built around tubes of trapped air, making it one of the most underrated insulating technologies in human history. What unites all these cultures is not the material they used, but the structure they created. Fur, hide, bark, and grass could not be more different. Yet every one of them worked because of how they managed air. The principle was universal, and settlers, soldiers, and engineers would eventually rediscover it centuries later. Structure, not material, determines whether the cold takes your life or gives you another day to fight. 5. WWII's great invention, the thin jacket liner. When the United States military began designing clothing for bitter European winters, they unknowingly walked the same path as the Inuit, the Sami, the Ainu, and countless others who had battled the cold before them. The solution they arrived at was not a thicker coat, not a denser fabric, but a thin, deceptively simple jacket liner that changed everything about how warmth could be engineered. The genius of the liner lay in its construction. Rows of channel stitching ran vertically and diagonally across its surface, locking small chambers of air into place. These channels prevented air from shifting or collapsing, ensuring that the warmth generated by the soldier's own body remained trapped exactly where it was needed. Beneath the outer cotton shell, multiple thin layers worked together to allow moisture to escape instead of soaking into the fabric. Sweat moved outward and evaporated safely, while the inner climate remained dry, something thick coats could never achieve. The geometry of the liner was as important as its materials. Thin layers offered flexibility without compromising insulation. Tightly stitched channels created a stable micro-architecture that stayed effective even under constant movement, pressure, and abuse. Unlike wool, which lost its loft when wet, the liner maintained its structure. And unlike heavy outerwear, it did not force the body to overheat and sweat, a fatal cycle in freezing environments. This was not a jacket. It was a microclimate system worn on the body, a portable environment engineered to preserve life. Soldiers who wore it quickly realized that the battle against cold was not won by overwhelming it with bulk, but by outsmarting it with design. The thin liner became one of the quiet miracles of World War II, a piece of gear that earned its reputation not through appearance but through the lives it saved. Sixth, pilots needed it first. The birth of microclimate engineering. Before infantry soldiers ever felt the warmth of the liner, it was pilots who first discovered its power. High above Europe, in unpressurized cockpits of early World War II aircraft, temperatures could plunge to 40 degrees below zero. Metal controls drained heat from bare hands within seconds, and oxygen masks frosted over so quickly that breathing became a battle of its own. In this hostile environment, bulky coats were a liability. They restricted movement, trapped sweat, and offered no protection once moisture turned to ice along the seams. Pilots needed something radically different. They needed insulation without stiffness, warmth without weight, and breathability without the risk of moisture soaking into the material. They needed a garment that did not fight their bodies, but worked with them, and the liner delivered exactly that. Its thin, flexible structure allowed pilots to move freely inside cramped cockpits. Its stitched channels prevented clumping when exposed to rapid temperature changes. Its moisture-resistant design stopped sweat from freezing into dangerous crusts of ice. And most importantly, it created a stable envelope of air around the core, an invisible layer of protection that no traditional coat could match. Word spread quickly. When ground troops saw what the pilots had, they traded for the liners, borrowed them, begged for them, and carried them into the trenches. What began as aviation gear evolved into one of the most indispensable survival tools of the war. And though the soldiers wearing them may not have understood the physics behind their warmth, they knew one thing for certain: nothing else kept them alive the same way. 7. When soldiers stole it. Why infantry loved the liner. Before long, word spread beyond the airfields. Infantrymen, freezing in foxholes and sleeping in mud-soaked dugouts, began noticing something unusual. Pilots' men who spent hours in the upper atmosphere were warmer than soldiers on the ground. And the difference was a thin, stitched liner hidden beneath their jackets. Soldiers began trading for it, borrowing it, and in many cases quietly stealing it. As one American infantryman recalled, 2 inches of wool couldn't beat that thin, damn liner. And in the forests of Europe, that was not a joke. That was survival. The most striking proof came during the siege of Bastogne, where temperatures plunged and supplies dwindled. Soldiers slept in shallow foxholes, surrounded by frozen soil and relentless wind. Heavy blankets slid off during the night or absorbed moisture until they hardened like planks. But the liner stayed close to the body. It hugged the core. It kept air trapped, even when everything else was failing. Many soldiers discovered they could sleep at least an hour or two without waking in uncontrollable shivers, a luxury in a battlefield winter. The liner reduced fatigue because it prevented the body from constantly fighting the cold. It protected core stability, ensuring that soldiers had enough strength at dawn to march, dig, or hold their rifles without trembling. And unlike blankets, which shifted, bunched, or froze out of shape, the liner never betrayed its wearer. It did not slip off. It did not sag. It did not turn into a block of ice the moment moisture touched it. It was dependable, quiet, invisible protection, precisely the kind of ally a soldier needed in the Winter War. In the end, the liner earned its place not through military orders, but through the unanimous approval of the men whose lives depended on it. 8. Blankets, the beautiful failure. Blankets have always carried a certain romance. They look warm, familiar, comforting. But in the brutal environment of a battlefield, that beauty became deception. A blanket was designed for a bed, a still room, a quiet night, not a frozen trench under artillery fire. And when the cold came with full force, blankets revealed their terrible flaw. They were built for the wrong world. Soldiers quickly learned that blanket fabric absorbed moisture with frightening ease. Snow, fog, sweat, even the humidity rising from the ground, all of it soaked into the fibers. As soon as darkness fell, the blanket stiffened. By dawn, it was a sheet of ice, a brittle slab more suited for roofing than warmth. Many soldiers described waking to find their blankets frozen into unnatural shapes, so rigid they could stand upright on their own. What was once soft and warm became a trap that leached heat from the body. But moisture wasn't the only killer. Blankets moved. They slipped off shoulders, slid down legs, legs, and exposed skin in the most vulnerable moments. Every small movement rolling over, adjusting gear, reaching for a canteen peeled warmth away, and forced the body to fight the cold all over again. Each adjustment cost energy. Each shiver was a penalty. And each lost pocket of air meant a deeper descent into fatigue. In the end, blankets on the battlefield became a dangerous illusion of comfort. They failed because they demanded perfect conditions to function, conditions war would never provide. The liner, by contrast, lived on the body. It moved with the body. It defended the core with quiet consistency. Where blankets surrendered to the cold, the liner quietly held its ground. Ninth, the metabolic war. Energy is the real currency. To understand why the liner mattered so much, we must understand what cold truly steals from the human body. It does not simply take comfort, it takes energy. Every violent shiver is the body burning precious calories in a desperate attempt to generate heat. In extreme cold, a person can lose 400 to 500 calories an hour just by trembling. That is the metabolic war, and it is far more ruthless than any enemy with a rifle. Soldiers in World War II were pushed to their limits long before battle ever began. The terrain demanded effort. The gear was heavy. The nights were long. Every calorie mattered. And the cold targeted those calories with precision. Many soldiers were not defeated by bullets or bombs, but by exhaustion, by bodies drained of energy from hours of shivering. They collapsed not from wounds, but from cold-induced fatigue. They lost their ability to focus, to march, to fight. This is where the jacket liner became more than clothing. It became a shield against metabolic collapse. By stabilizing the core, it prevented unnecessary shivering. By managing moisture, it stopped the catastrophic cooling that occurred when sweat froze. And by trapping still pockets of air, it reduced the body's need to generate constant heat. Soldiers reported feeling noticeably stronger, more alert, and more capable during operations simply because the liner allowed their bodies to conserve energy. The truth is simple and profound. The liner did not just keep men warm. It kept them alive by preserving the one currency more valuable than ammunition, food, or fuel: human energy. On a battlefield where every step required endurance and every breath carried a cost, the liner gave soldiers the power to keep going when others could not. And that, more than anything else, is why this thin, humble layer outperformed coats twice its size and blankets that promised comfort but delivered misery. 10. Tougher than wool. Why the liner survived abuse. On the battlefield, nothing remained clean, dry, or untouched. Gear was not gently folded in barracks. It was dragged, crushed, soaked, burned, and frozen. And in this brutal environment, the jacket liner proved it was built for war in a way wool never could be. Soldiers told stories of liners being dragged through mud during night movements, then dried briefly over open flames, only to be thrown back on minutes later. They spoke of liners soaked in freezing rain, trampled under boots, or splattered with snow and ash. Yet each time, the liner returned to its original purpose with surprising reliability. Wool, by contrast, deteriorated quickly. Once wet, it collapsed into dense, heavy sheets that lost their loft, the very structure that made wool warm. The fibers matted together, destroying the tiny air spaces needed for insulation. And when wool dried, it often hardened, shrinking into stiff panels that no longer fit the body or trapped heat effectively. What once seemed like nature's perfect cold-weather solution fell apart under the relentless abuse of war. The liner, however, behaved differently. Its stitched channels preserved structure even when the materials inside shifted. Its thin layers dried faster, and every cycle of movement seemed to settle the air pockets more evenly. Some soldiers claimed their liners worked better after weeks of wear than when they were new, and in a way they were right. As the fabric softened and the layers conformed to the body, the microclimate inside the liner grew increasingly stable, forming a personalized insulation system shaped by experience, hardship, and survival. 11th, modern science confirms what WWII soldiers knew. When modern researchers revisited the liner's design, they discovered something remarkable. The soldiers were right all along. In bushcraft communities around the world, enthusiasts recreated military liners using cotton shells and thin layered batting. In controlled outdoor tests, a 4-layer liner regularly outperformed a coat more than an inch thick. Even in damp environments, the liner maintained warmth because its air channel geometry prevented collapse, something synthetic loft materials struggle with as soon as moisture enters the system. Reenactors and winter survival specialists have performed similar experiments. Many report comfortably operating in temperatures of -15 degrees Celsius while wearing modern variants of World War II liners beneath light jackets. Meanwhile, thicker parkas, once wet, became liabilities, the same failure seen on frozen battlefields decades earlier. What science discovered only recently, soldiers had learned the hard way. Moisture is the true enemy, and still air is the true ally. Laboratory studies now confirm that structured air pockets retain heat far more effectively than dense padding when humidity is present. Geometry beats bulk. Air beats synthetics. The liner's stitched channels were not primitive, they were precise engineering, decades ahead of their time. And the most humbling revelation is this: our ancestors did not need scientific terminology to build these systems. They simply paid attention to what worked. The liner was a rediscovery of ancient wisdom wearing a modern uniform, and science is only now catching up to its brilliance. 12th, rebuilding the system today. Not a jacket, a logic. The genius of the WWII liner is not the fabric or the stitching pattern. It is the logic behind it, the understanding that insulation is a system, not a single object. Today, anyone can recreate that logic using modern gear. Sleeping bag liners, for example, apply the same principle by creating a stable air layer inside a bag, allowing the user to stay warm without relying solely on thickness. Vapor barrier clothing, though counterintuitive, prevents evaporation from draining the body's heat, buying precious hours in emergencies. Wind layers, placed strategically outside, stop convection before it has the chance to steal warmth from the inner layers. Even ultra-light emergency shelters rely on this philosophy. The thin, reflective blankets used by hikers do not warm by themselves. They trap air and prevent radiant heat from escaping. In cold survival training, instructors teach that your first priority is not finding thicker materials, but creating an environment where your body's own heat can thrive. Whether using natural fibers, synthetic fabrics, or improvised materials, the lesson remains the same. Build the airspace, control the moisture, and let the body do the rest. This is the truth settlers, soldiers, and even ancient hunters understood. Warmth does not come from piling on weight. It comes from shaping the invisible. In the end, the liner is not something to copy stitch by stitch. It is a reminder that survival belongs to those who understand the physics of their own breath, their own heat, and the fragile boundary between comfort and catastrophe. 13th, the final truth. Humans survive by understanding cold, not fighting it. When we step back from the battlefield stories, the experiments, and the engineering, one realization rises above all others. The WWII jacket liner was never just a piece of clothing. It was a testament to human understanding, proof that survival favors wisdom over brute force. A thin, modest insert saved more lives than the thickest winter coats, because it obeyed the laws of nature rather than defying them. Cold does not care about appearances. It does not reward weight or thickness or the feeling of comfort. It respects only knowledge. The knowledge that still air is precious. That moisture is lethal. That warmth begins with the body, not the fabric. The liner succeeded because it honored these truths. It turned simplicity into strength, structure into safety, and history into an instruction manual for staying alive. And that is the final lesson this forgotten invention leaves us. The ancient ideas, the humble materials, and the unassuming design, all of them remind us that survival is not won by fighting the cold with force, but by understanding how it moves, how it steals, and how it can be stopped. Cold does not care what you wear. It only cares how well you understand it. And in that understanding, humans have always found their greatest warmth.